Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. I'm SocietySucks and today I'm checking out why did Mao win the Chinese Civil War by History Matters. I don't know much about Chinese history, well, recent Chinese history, because I just don't find it that interesting. I prefer ancient Chinese history. But anyway, let's see how the communists in China managed to win the Civil War.
In 1949, after years of bitter fighting, Mao Zedong declared the creation of the People's Republic of China. And just under a year later, his new government had finished mopping up most of the opposing nationalist forces, leaving only Taiwan in their hands. But the government had finished mopping up...
Look, this is China we're talking about. Pretty much all of their population is here in the east, while the west is mostly just empty. Well, except for maybe this part right here, but I would consider this to be part of the east.
Most of the opposing nationalist forces, leaving only Taiwan in their hands. But as many of you will know, as of 1945, Mao's communists were only in control of this territory, whereas the nationalists had the rest, including all of China's industrial centers.
How did they manage to lose?
They also had financial and material support from the United States, as well as having a larger army and population base to work with. This raises an obvious question.
Whoa, how much?
As well as having a larger army and population base.
345 to 90 million. How could they have lost while having almost 4 times as many people
to work with? This raises an obvious question. How on earth did the communists win when they started at such a disadvantage? Why was Mao victorious in the Chinese Civil War? Now, it's important to note that whilst the Chinese Civil War is often seen as something occurring in the wake of World War II, it had actually been ongoing since either the early 1920s or 5 seconds after the fall of the Qing dynasty, depending on how you count it. As you'll all know, China had been ruled by emperors since basically forever, and this continued up until 1911 when... revolution. After a ceasefire, Yuan Shikai, the new prime minister, managed to convince the emperor to abdicate and he then became president. Not sufficiently happy with his new title, Shikai had a thought. Being in charge is okay, but how can I do it in a robe? Which is when he had the brilliant idea of making himself emperor in late 1915. This went down about as well as you'd expect, and within a few months there was another civil war followed by...
So it's basically, how can I be in charge without actually doing anything?
China wasn't really a unified political entity, with different warlords claiming sovereignty over their own territories and cliques. And the one in control of Beijing was given the support of the international powers and so could claim to be the legitimate rulers of China, but honestly it was all just a mess. During this period, in the south of the country, the nationalists who wanted the restoration of the 1912 Republican Constitution formed an alliance with the communists to fight against the ruling clique in the north. By 1927, the nationalists and the communists were on the cusp of victory, when the nationalist leader, Chiang Kai-shek, decided that he didn't need the communists anymore and so it was time for a violent purge. He offed all of the communists that he could reach and the rest fled into the countryside. The next year, Chiang overthrew the government and made himself the head of the new nationalist Chinese state. He now had 2 problems though. The first was the ever more aggressive Japanese government next door, who in 1931 made their full intentions clear when it took control of Manchuria and placed it under the rule of the last Qing emperor as their puppet state. The second problem was the ongoing communist insurgency throughout the Chinese countryside. There were numerous communist strongholds throughout the country, which the nationalists would surround and crush one by one, the most notable of which was here in the mountains of Jiangxi. The nationalists moved in for the kill in 1934, but the communists were able to escape and begin what is now called the Long March, where over the course of a year, communist forces marched across all of China before ending up here in Yan'an, having lost only 90% of their soldiers. You'd think that this would
only
be a
90%.
communist ambitions, but fun fact, no. Instead, they reconstituted their forces and began another insurgency. After some good old-fashioned communist infighting, Mao Zedong appeared as the leader of the communists, and he decided to focus on the rural peasantry instead of urban workers, which gave him access to more soldiers who appreciated his anti-landowner policies. Chiang Kai-shek was determined to crush them, but his advisors and generals pushed him to instead negotiate. The reason for this was that it was obvious to them that Japan would soon invade and
the biggest threat was definitely Japan at the time.
And so they wanted the government's full attention focused on repelling them. As such, the two sides started to negotiate, but Chiang was only using it as a diversion, leading his generals to do the only thing that they could think of to convince him: kidnap him, which they did in late 1936. They negotiated with the communists who were now no longer interested in making an accord, but instead in getting rid of Chiang permanently. This didn't happen because the Soviet government threatened to withhold military aid if Chiang was harmed, because Moscow wanted a stronger China to counterbalance Japan, who had both of them in their sights. Chiang reluctantly agreed and was then promptly released, after which he then publicly declared that he never meant any of it. The next year, the Japanese began the Second Sino-Japanese War, or World War II, depending on how you look at it. And the nationalists and the communists soon came to an accord because they both agreed that those guys were worse. Now, the war didn't start well for the nationalists, and by 1939...
Yeah, I mean, they had a common enemy, so they were kind of at peace for the time being. But obviously, in this kind of situation, I would think that both sides would try to make sure that the other is weakened as much as possible so that after the Japanese are dealt with, they can just get a nice and easy victory. Because hopefully, the opposing side will be weakened so much that they can't do anything.
And the Japanese were able to push them all the way back to here, whereas the communists resorted to guerrilla warfare and were able to damage the Japanese war effort from behind their lines. The united front between the nationalists and the communists was never very strong, and when the communists were able to incorporate more civilians into their forces and they sensed nationalist weakness, the two soon started fighting again. Part of this was that the nationalist army was obviously too busy to reallocate enough forces to suppress the communists, but the communists were easily able to find allies and recruits during the war, mostly because of the conduct and the competence of the nationalists. Said army and government was incredibly corrupt and would often rob Chinese civilians and openly steal tax revenue for themselves. And throughout the war and the preceding civil war, the nationalists had a reputation for brutal reprisals against anyone who stood against them, or anyone who they thought had collaborated with the Japanese or the communists. This, combined with their inability to stop the Japanese advance and the desperate
now it's making more sense why the communists won.
Chinese people saw them as useless brutes, whereas the communists had been quick to release any prisoners of war that didn't want to join them and had strictly forbidden their soldiers from stealing from local populations. Also, the fact that they were the smaller force and also weren't often directly engaging the Japanese meant that they could paint themselves as far more successful. So in 1941, Japan decided that fighting China alone was boring, and so invited America and the British Empire to fight too. As you'll all be
that's
aware,
when they
this
messed
was
up.
the start of the end of the Japanese Empire. After a couple of American bombs and a Soviet invasion of Manchuria, the Japanese surrendered, World War II was over, and the Chinese now had to look to rebuilding their country, with the nationalists in control of this, the communists this, and the Soviets occupying Manchuria, which they agreed to give back as soon as they were done looting its industry. Communist guerrillas had spent most of the war building up strong.
I wasn't actually aware that the Soviets occupied Manchuria, but I suppose I shouldn't be too surprised. It's the Soviets after all.
Holds across China, and the loyal local populations weren't going to suddenly side with the nationalists, especially given the fact that Chiang Kai-shek's government was quick to restore the Chinese landlords who had lost all of their land to the Japanese or communists, which was obviously not very popular with the peasantry. Another issue for the restored nationalist government was that it needed foreign help to even return to power. Chiang couldn't get his troops back to the cities to receive the Japanese surrender. As such, his troops had to be taken there by the United States, and some of this took so long that the surrendered Japanese forces were asked to garrison cities to prevent the increasingly popular communists from taking them over. And so, needing the help of their former brutal enemy was extremely damaging to Chiang's legitimacy. Soon after the war ended, the economy fell apart and the government couldn't pay its soldiers, many of whom defected to Mao. Now, even though Mao was more powerful than he'd ever been before, he still had a difficult task ahead of him. But he would soon get
conquering all of China.
As the Soviet Union was withdrawing from Manchuria, it was sure to hand the Japanese weapons and equipment it had captured to the communists. Now, Moscow had agreed to hand Manchuria over to Chiang's government, and so, to help Mao, they invited communist troops into the territory and helped them to build strongholds to fight from, whilst letting nationalist forces into the cities to technically fulfill their agreement. Briefly, Chiang and Mao tried to negotiate forming a government together, but this was obviously stupid, and so civil war broke out again. The communists resorted yet again to guerrilla tactics and wore the nationalist armies down. The Americans initially supported the nationalists with a lot of arms and money, but slowly their support began to wane. You see, the US military wasn't all too impressed by Chiang and his corrupt generals, who, throughout the civil conflicts in the war, the Japanese had refused to undertake any offensives or lend
so they were just incompetent
the basis
then
of their personal power, and as such, they didn't want to lose it. Soon,
incompetent and hated by the peasantry, the common man.
When Chiang refused to allow democratic elections and also openly supported Harry Truman's opponent in the 1948 presidential election, the US decided to concentrate on other things and leave the nationalists to their fate. Now, it won't surprise you to learn that in the wake of the withdrawal of American support, the nationalist
may have been a bit of a mistake, because then China was communist and an ally of the Soviets.
Position weakened. In the year following, Chiang and his allies were forced to flee south, and it looked like there would be no foreign intervention to help them. Except there very briefly was. This wasn't the US returning or the British or French getting involved. This time it was Joseph Stalin who asked Mao to stop his advance down south. Stalin tried to convince Mao that advancing further south would stretch his forces out too thin and would force the Western allies to intervene, because obviously they wouldn't allow a member of the brand new UN Security Council to fall, especially to communists. But as you'll all know, they very clearly could. In fact, this attempted intervention was mostly because Stalin saw a divided China similar to a divided Germany. If Mao's China only controlled this, then it would need the USSR for its security against a permanent enemy. Whereas, if he held all of China, eventually he would be able to act independently. If you've ever seen China on a map, you'll know that Mao refused. And within a few months of this, the nationalist government had collapsed and its remnants had fled to Taiwan. Mao then proclaimed the birth of the People's Republic of China, which marked the first time that the country had been politically unified since the last days of the Qing dynasty.
Really makes you think, doesn't it? Who's the real China? China or Taiwan? So basically, Mao won because the opposing side were just incompetent, they were not liked by the common people, and foreign intervention on the opposing side just slowly started going down. And Mao also had the USSR's backing, so yeah. It's no surprise that he eventually won, took the W. Did that end up being a bad thing for the Chinese? Probably. But as long as I can get a bunch of products cheaply, I don't really care. Who cares about those Chinese people who are slaving away in factories for basically no pay? As long as I can get everything for cheap, I do not care. I'm actually not 100% sure if it's actually that bad in China or if those are just stereotypes and that's not actually the case. I mean, I've never been to China, so I wouldn't know. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. If you want to see more reactions, check out this video right here. And with that, I hope I'll see you in the next video.